like my film to begin with a shot that seems extreme, in the sense that it dictates the course of events rather than being a passive tolerance of things to follow. Such as a man with an artificial leg, his limbs won't take him as far as a train would. Perhaps such an opening shot rightly establishes the figurative language of a film that's made up of travel footage that I would have a hard time employing elsewhere. But why must the glaring reality of his disability be the object of our attention just because it's right there to be scrutinized? What if he's among the gifted few men who can recall their dreams bit by bit? What if he's afraid of his own reflection in the mirror? Wouldn't those be interesting premises to dig further into? Possibly, but I'll have to wait to make that film till they start making cameras that capture dreams and fears. Scene shifts, because anything that the first shot of a film refers to has already happened before the film even begins. In the case of my film, it was the incredible blending of the ordinary legless man with the other ordinary people at the station that prevented me from investigating what his dignified walk down the stairs may have referred to. One of my recent breakthroughs in life as someone with real limited sportsmanship skills was finally plunging into running, despite the risk of appearing amateurish at the beginning. The advantage running has over other sports is that it allows you to be on your own with no liability towards any other human being. Though it is my experience that anyone in the habit of clinging to his solitude must at some point trust what is difficult and go out in search of something that helps him move out of it. The solitude. Raina Maria Rilke writes, "Your solitude will be your home and haven in the midst of very strange conditions, and from there you will discover all your paths." But what about the solitude that with time begins to mimic the very cage that it once helped you escape, setting the confines within which you are allowed to even see or feel? All you can do then is to quickly find a way to move out of it before it consumes you in entirety. But it is also true that what appears to be a curse in the short run might just turn out to be an incentive in the long run. And that, in my understanding, was the point that Rilke was trying to make when you look at it in a broader context. His advice to the young poet in the book Letters to the Young Poet is to immerse in his own world, to look within, and if from this looking within poems come, it is an indication that his art needs no external validation, because the only way to judge a good work of art is to see if it was born out of some kind of necessity. As profound as Rilke's words sound, they create a sense of doubt inside me when I confess to myself that this film that you're watching right now might just be my first film up until now that isn't born out of a necessity. I wasn't itching to place one seemingly unrelated shot after another with an essay-like narration, hoping that it all comes together at some point. I wasn't itching to make this in the same way that I did to convey the existential dread I felt around the time that I made the 2 short films before this. The self-importance in my previous statement becomes evident soon after I start playing fast and loose with the word art. After all, there would have been no question of any self-doubt had it not been for the assumption that this film is in some way a work of art. But who am I to make this assumption? Philosophers and thinkers of the free world have been sweating blood over the years, trying to conjure up a reliable definition of the word. without much success. Did you hear about the incident where two teenagers in California visited an art museum where they judged the artworks to be subpar and thought they could do better? They placed a pair of glasses on the floor to see if their art would ignite some sort of spiritual fire inside the museum goers. It did, and the glasses on the floor was seen as some kind of obscure, avant-garde mastery. The idea of travel, against the backdrop of the way things stand the way they do currently, seems too commercially diluted with utopian pursuits of spirituality, self, peace and such. While it is hard to deny that there may be some truth to this cliche just like all other cliches, traveling for me has largely been a way of unspoken, private rebellion against the life of appropriacy and its machinery. Whatever is being denied you out of regulation, bias towards the collective and against the individual, simple ignorance and sometimes even hatred, the seemingly harmless act of travel is one of defiance against it. I am communicating all this to you from another world, a world of stillness and four walls. While on most days this becomes preferable to the illusion of freedom, the wind in my hair and the unceasing landscapes, there is something about traveling with strangers that makes me think of empty confessional booths. For the life of me, I can't remember having had conversations involving as much candor with a parent or a partner. Had I had a sibling who was deaf and mute, or even just mute, I am positive that I would have had less romantic things to say about travel or strangers who travel. Another thing about travel that you may find exasperating or adventurous depending upon your disposition is that you're likely to find yourself at the mercy of the unexpected and the random, of other human beings and their carelessness, of nature and its untimely wrath. The possibilities of paranoia are endless. I consider myself fortunate sitting here in one piece and documenting my fortune, that the cook of this nameless restaurant in this nameless town of Uttarakhand, who would have probably gotten away with slipping something deadly into my breakfast if he wanted to, was kind enough to not do it. That our driver was in just the right state of mind to not goof up on these dangerous mountain roads on the day we happened to be his hostages. Or that a landslide, which is a fairly common occurrence in this part of the country, did not end up being a killjoy at the precise moment that I stood on this spot. Especially when thousands of people around the world have these things happen to them on a daily basis. As I said before, possibilities of paranoia are endless. So are the possibilities of human stupidity. The night before we began our journey for the base camp was when I decided I will smoke my last cigarette and kick this filthy habit once and for all. The timing couldn't have been better with a taxing high altitude climb coming up. And if I didn't do it now, I knew that my respiratory system would take a personal interest in my suffering over the next 1 week. Recording myself on camera with a few closing remarks on my last cigarette was a digital token of honor I intended to use to inject myself with guilt whenever my allegiance to self appeared under threat. The next day, while having lunch in another nameless restaurant of a nameless town, this 62-year-old gentleman who was to be my co-trekker was kind enough to try and motivate me by recounting his struggles with cigarette addiction and how quitting turned out to be one of the best decisions of his life, evident in the fitness levels he had managed to maintain at his age. So of course, the next thing I remember thinking is that it was an ideal moment for a cigarette, and I stumbled out of the room. The traps are several, all snapping shut at the same time. Out there, 3,000 kilometers away, on a quiet sandy beach in Pondicherry, a man sleeps unaware of the waves approaching him with increasing intensity. Or maybe he's too aware of them. The scene reminds me of the painting of a girl on the beach in Coen Brothers' Barton Fink. Some saw it as a representation of the freedom which Barton himself lacked. Some saw it as a mockery of the culture prevailing in LA at the time. But when Coens were asked about the intended meaning, they said that the painting was meant to create a feeling of isolation. Art within art often takes the form of metaphors, and there's a thin line between brilliance and narcissism, which often gets crossed when filmmakers try to give their work some semblance of meaning, the understanding of which they themselves lack. I have always admired Coen brothers for not taking the bait and maintaining their sanctity. Standing at 11,000 feet above sea level, looking at the sun, it's hard to imagine that this is the same sun that lights up the city you bolted in impatience just 48 hours ago. Somehow the heat seems less torturous at this height. Or maybe it's the fact that I have something to look forward to now, that I'm able to block out this minor inconvenience. Everything around me seems charged with meaning. As a mode of diffusing the optimism, I break into a full body sweat, thinking about the cardiovascular abilities involved to make it to 14,200 feet. I have noticed that one of the common methods of unwinding that trek leaders like employing after a long day's trek is recounting personal experiences with elusive mountain ghosts. On this occasion, he tells us about his friend whom he found bloody and battered outside their tent, surprisingly still alive after an encounter with the lady ghost whose reputation still renders that campsite fairly desolate. The homicidal ghost was pretty straightforward in her approach. She calls out her victim in a sweet angelic voice that disorients him, and once he falls into the bait of walking out of the tent, she hurts him in ways yet unknown to contemporary man. It is highly unlikely outside of choreographed entertainment for ghosts, if they exist at all, to be needlessly violent in this way, for man seems to have taken it upon himself already to carry out this task. Besides, it's well documented that high altitudes can sometimes pose the challenge of sorting incidents into real and dreamed. The next day, I tried to tell him that his story, albeit interesting, failed to connect some of the dots pertaining to logic. His response: "What story?" On a reasonably pleasant day in the colorful streets of Pondicherry, one would be hard-pressed to walk in any direction without interrupting an ongoing photo session of a tourist. One of the popular travel websites describes Pondicherry as a love child of the French and Indian culture. At which juncture in history colonialism came to be equated with love remains unclear to me. But it's curious that Pondicherry still treats its French influences with the reverence of a grown adult who still sees her parents from the perspective of a tiny child, and always will. She never wants to think of her youth as a thing of the past. I didn't stay there long enough to look beyond the surface into its depths, but it's possible that Pondicherry puts on her good face of India's French city with a smile mimicking those of her tourists, as if to say, "You can keep my pictures while I keep my secrets." There are things that can never be taught, and things that make the existing condition worse when taught. For me, it's the ability to be sociable, or rather the lack of it. When everybody is laughing and there is seldom anything to laugh about, every conversation seems to be an excessive continuation of things already said. It's like as T.S. Eliot once said, "The world doesn't end with a bang, but when the DJ at a party of 30 deaf mutes announces that it's the last song of the night." Those weren't his exact words, but I wonder what he would say looking at the absurdity of life in the year 2020. Looking in the mirror, I also wonder if it's the year 2020 that doesn't quite make me dance the way last year did, or if it's me who dances less with each passing year.
Oh, how they wail, and oh, how they weep, and me as the maestro, onward I lead, leading my great symphony.
Anyone that brings any expectations on a high altitude trek is going to get them all crusty. The idea is to map out some path between anticipating something extraordinarily beautiful and mockery making of the beauty when it does come along. Because beauty, by its very nature, is very sensitive to the presence of impatience. Very often, in pursuit of the perfect frame, I would get carried away with the camera in my hand, while what lay there right in front of my eyes for me to sit back and appreciate would evaporate, lost forever among the other splendid delusions. I realized quickly that if I were to get some meaningful footage on this trek for my film, the camera needs to be transformed from a mere prop into a permanent extension of myself, the invisible eye. Another case of the meta-modernist standards by which we have come to gaze the authenticity of all works of art. An actor acted well if he conceals the fact that he was acting. A stand-up comedian is funny when instead of trying to make you laugh, he appears to be narrating a story, as if to a friend. A filmmaker is worth his salt if he layers his philosophy under the guise of satire or drama, instead of being preachy about it. I wait for the day chefs put the debate over whether or not chefs are artists to rest by serving a plate full of wasabi and soy sauce while asking their customers to imagine their best version of a sushi to go with it.
Some kind of phenomenal. 305 at about 10 degrees horizon directly north. We've got two strange objects, half moon shape, dancing about with colored lights on them. 400 hours, one object still hovering over Woodbridge Base at about 5 to 10 degrees off the horizon.
Milan Kundera writes, "Memory does not film, memory photographs." If there's any truth to those words, there's no reason why the embarrassment of your fall down the stairs, or the failure to articulate yourself properly, or other moments of unguarded vulnerability in front of other people should torment you once the moment has passed. The magical eye of the camera, on the other hand, is at the center of it all. It remembers everything. Even the briefest of self-conscious glances at the ever-watchful lens is an irreparable breach of the theory which says that time is linear. The totality of all human gestures contained in a single 32 by 24 mm memory chip. Chips designed to last for 10 years, in a best case scenario. Midnight has stuck on the dial of Indian folklore. The need for new stories in this country was never as urgent as it is now. If you were brought up in India, the names of Dushyant and Shakuntala were very likely invoked in your hearing on countless childhood occasions. Much like many other tales from the Mahabharata, the love story of Dushyant and Shakuntala, if one can call it a story of love, continues to be adapted and retold today, even centuries after it was first written. The prospect of witnessing some form of live art in a small town of Rajasthan gave me hope, but that was the only source of hope I felt that night. And of course, as a way of contemporizing the drama to make it more palatable, instead of a forest, the meeting place of our protagonists is now a theatre rehearsal. Instead of a king, Dushyant is now the director of a play. And instead of a hermit, Shakuntala, a struggling actor. But the crux remains the same. The woman falls hopelessly in love with the man to the point where she can't think of anything better to do with her time, except for daydreaming about him 24/7. While the man himself, after doing the bare minimum of saying ditto to the girl's admission of feelings for him, leaves, only to get busy with his occupational duties and completely forget that there existed a girl named Shakuntala in his life. The recipe for tragic romance finds its culmination in the final act, where by the time the man returns to his senses, the girl has already died. With different permutations and combinations of gender roles, geographical contexts, the feel for tragedy and choice of music, there is an abundance of this narrative in our cinema and literature. Sitting at the popular sunrise point of Promenade Beach, I understood that when people talk about the eye-catching aspects of a sunrise, they are not really referring to the sun, but the tiny window of 5 to 7 minutes between darkness and the first visual evidence of sun, during which the sky gets painted in vivid hues of yellow and orange. The only political space I found in Pondicherry was this wall, where in an act of ambiguous rebellion, a person had scribbled the name of an Argentinian footballer next to the name of India's Prime Minister. Or maybe it was the other way around. By the day, the fascinating dynamics that accompany the charged silence of a coastal city take up a completely different meaning. One could contemplate effectually on the fundamental concepts common to philosophy, physics, and the cyclical nature of history. As night sets in, Pondicherry begins the process of bridging its gap with other urban cities, until eventually the last vestige of individuality is erased, and time goes by as you drink and talk in a world that is rosy, cheerful, full of fellowship and peace on earth. Inspired by the literature of Frank Herbert and Jorge Luis Borges, I took up the task of imagining a planet that could one day constitute the set of a science fiction novel. My aim is to create something that stays within the realm of logic while being too fantastical for any kind of audiovisual adaptation. Let's call it Sura. The philosophy and morality of their people is grounded in the supposition that every form of truth presents itself as a riddle. Solving the riddles isn't as important as preserving them, for they believe that the accumulation of riddles will one day lead to a confusion so universal that the initial search for the truth will be forever forgotten. That will mark the beginning of a civilization that isn't inherently chained to the governance of a prearranged meaning. Naturally, only two profitable occupations exist on Sura: poetry and hypnosis. Former, to drive forward a culture where riddles can multiply in diverse and colorful ways, and hypnosis, to counter that culture. The hypnotist school of thought says that linearity of riddle forming is the only way to achieve a universal confusion among men, because only after all possibilities of mystery have been exhausted will they be able to scratch their collective heads and say, "What now?" Natives of Sura are either solipsistic or cynics. Their language is only designed to accommodate events that haven't yet taken place. Past or present has no relevance as far as objectivity is concerned. Optimists are considered illiterate or total airheads because facts are usually on the side of cynics, or on rare occasions, solipsists. For example, on the cover page of the book The Last Poem, written by one of their most celebrated poets, Mr. Muriel M. Candenza, are inscribed the words, "And let it be said in passing that the language here is simplified for the understanding of my English-speaking audience. I, whose youth knows no beginning nor end, never was, but always will be, pardoner of deeds and repository of fate. You never saw me, but always know that I'm just around the corner." In the unlikely event that an optimist opens a book, he takes these words as an omen of the metaphorical arrival of the higher power of his understanding. A solipsist gets teary-eyed receiving the homage of the acclaimed author and immediately gets down to construct an elaborate letter to himself, congratulating himself for yet another splendid piece of writing. cynic quickly flips through the pages to ascertain if he'll be able to finish the book in one sitting, because he takes it for granted that the answer to the riddle is tomorrow, consequently beginning to doubt whether he will get the spare time to read tomorrow. This script speaks more of my limitations as a student of philosophy than of the historical repercussions of the ideologies I invariably ended up comparing. I'm aware. But I am careful not to get too bogged down by that, because all intellectual pursuits are eventually useless. I am not convinced that this book will ever reach its culmination, but I intend to keep adding characters, plots, subplots, and the occasional twists and turns until I reach a point where Sura takes over my home planet. Whether it does so in form or just my imagination is of no consequence to me. After all, what could be more irresistible than living in a world where no one understands your language or thoughts or ambitions, and you go on living as if in a perpetual state of anonymity?